this next 10 meeting, which is to focus on, what we need to do to make Node successful for the next 10 years. And we will follow what we have on our agenda. So let me pull that actually up. Hold on. So what we have on the agenda, and I suggest we talk about them slightly in different orders. The first one, prioritizing technical values, is what we've spent the last few meetings talking about. And the current status on that is we have a PR open. And I guess I should put that into PR, into the issue itself. So basically, we have a PR open in Node Core. It looks like it's been favorably received. This is the PR right here. So, I think we can agree we're probably closed on capturing the technical values for the project and move on to the other issues. So does anybody have anything on that they'd like to talk about? Okay, so the next thing that's on the agenda is the next 10 years for collaborators. So we've talked about, looking at the technical direction and the technology components that would be important. But Mary opened this issue to basically reflect that we probably also want to include in the overall discussion, what it should look like for collaborators, and what we should be doing on that front as well. So that's tagged for the agenda. So I think at this point, those are the only things we had on the agenda, and having worked through the technical values, we should agree on what we think is the most important thing to kind of focus as the next step towards moving this forward. So, we have we could look at the collaborator front things. We could start to look at technology areas that we think are important. What do people think is a good way to move forward on that?
I'm just wondering, like, how many folks from, like, I know yourself, Michael, are on the TSC. Like, I feel like it's extremely valuable to have them coming to this call now.
It is, although we've certainly made the awareness call, and we can't necessarily. I don't know what else to do in terms of invites or encouragement. I think in absence of that, we can, like the values, I think we can come up with a proposal, and then we need to make sure that we've got the TSC like agreeing, disagreeing, or at least if there's no opinion, then there's no opinion. But I think hopefully concrete things, like if we say X is the most important thing that we work on, hopefully that will generate discussion, right? If it's not the right thing. I'm open to other ideas though. Like if you have some other suggestions of what we should do, let's talk about those.
Sorry, can you promote? Sorry, I think you're host, so nobody
Yep.
else.
Yep. Sure, I'll make you co-host too, so you can do that. So I don't know, Darcy, if you have any ideas of other things we should do on that front.
No, I'm wondering if a lot of this would there's a lot of thumbs up for the technical doc, and like just as it was, so it feels like a lot of people had time to review it async, and maybe you don't have any other feedback to give right now. So
yeah, I think on the technical values, I think hopefully we would have heard if there was significant objections, or we hadn't quite captured what's been done. So in terms of the next big thing to tackle, I think maybe we could spend a little bit of time brainstorming what other like concrete artifacts would we want to come up with and start to work on, right? Like I can see we could have ones around strategic technical focus areas, like we think we need to do focus on a new HTTP, on WebAssembly, or on, we could come up with something that tries to capture that. The other one that's suggested in the issue 16 is to say, okay, well, what would we change in terms of the collaborator experience?
Personally, that topic gets my vote for, because I think, and why I'm saying that is, I think that, like, you bring up the HTTP thing, this group, I mean, I think really that we just need to farm out to the rest of the groups and contributors, right? And just say, like, here, open up an issue to add your item to the list. Whereas I think, talking through what might be blockers for, a broader contributor base or that kind of thing is more just like the general conversation, which is in line with, I think, what we've been having in these meetings before.
Right. For the technical areas, maybe we need to put in, like you're saying, open an issue. We need to figure out the mechanism by which we do that, right? So yeah, we don't necessarily have to dive in, but like what's the next concrete step in terms of getting that feedback so that we can help capture it? Is it an issue in the node repo that says, please add your technical, or somewhere, please add what you think are the, technical priorities?
So that's a very interesting thought, because I would take one step back, and it's like, what's the engagement model look like? Like you're saying, like, open an issue. It's like, how many people know where to find that issue? How many
Right.
people know that, and then in terms of how we promote things and how we get visibility to the community, do we only have so many channels that we use? Like, is it always that we're creating issues and PRs on GitHub, or is it always that we're just
Right.
tweeting from one specific, channel? Do we only use Google Forms? All these types of things are interesting to think about in terms of how are we reaching potential people,
Right.
potential audience that could be a collaborator or wants to be but doesn't know it yet,
Mm-hmm.
and wants to give their opinion or voice their opinion, but they just don't know, because we're only limiting, again, yeah, like we're only limiting like the tooling to and the way we engage on one platform or another. So I don't know.
Yeah, what would be some, that's like, what are the things we could do? We could run surveys, we could run,
I'm thinking like we should first identify like who the audience is, right? So something like, even for our working group, sort of working groups that we have in the project, we have like, I'll just use package maintenance working group, we should consider the audience for that to be beyond the scope of Node, right? And the Node community, right? We should be potentially reaching out to other communities to ask them if, these are solved problems.
Right.
And I think there's opportunity for us to do a better job. And to Mary's point, like to maybe think about how we engage potential collaborators. Right? Anybody could potentially be a
Right.
collaborator, or anybody could have feedback they want to give us. And it's not, we might also want to be mindful that we don't do that today, because we might increase the surface area of that feedback. And I'm not sure, that may not be what we want, right? Like you may not want, like,
I think the constituencies, I pasted the link in the, we worked on who were the constituencies. That's probably a good thing to keep in mind in terms of like, where should we be getting feedback from, right?
Yeah, like where do those people live? Where they're like,
right.
Where do those tribes or those folks, what are the channels they use? Because then that will dictate how we go and communicate with them or ask for feedback, right? So like, sure, let's say the mechanism for how we're going to get feedback is like a Google form. We have a set of questions we'd love to know the answers to from those communities. But then where do we share that form, right?
I mean, I do personally think just going out and say, tell me your lists, is not going to work very well. Like I think, from what I see working reasonably well is to try and actually come up with something concrete, even if it's completely wrong. And then people know how to chime in on that and say, oh, something's missing, or no, I totally disagree with that, or the white space doesn't seem to get much concrete feedback.
Just
So
to add a little bit onto that, sort of where's the on ramp for people. I did go and check the live stream link on one of the discussions we had just recently, like after the live stream went, and there was actually a bunch of people chatting. And one of the things somebody said in there was, yeah, I come to these sometimes on the Node channel, and like, I'm way too much of a beginner to understand a single word that was said in this meeting. And it's like, well, there's a missed opportunity for us. Like that person came to engage and we were way in the weeds, which is the right thing for that conversation. But also like we missed an opportunity to bring that person either in somehow or, provide the right content for them to be able to consume. And I don't think we should, tailor every single meeting that we live stream to that, but also like maybe there's something we could think about where it brings that person along and
Well, in
maybe
10 years
redirects
they could be a core contributor, right? Like
Yeah,
if that's
exactly.
what we're thinking about, like how do we ensure that there's fresh opinions, a diverse group of people coming to and contributing to the project over the next decade. It's like we have to really consider, yeah, like exactly what you're saying, Wes. Like you know, how did we miss that opportunity? And like, was it just that we don't look at? I know I'm when we're running the npm calls, like I know that I have a hard time like keeping up to date with like the various places where people could be chatting. So yeah,
And
it's
so
just
one
an
thing,
interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, it totally is. I agree with you completely, and I don't monitor that either. I know, but way back when we were doing some of the original regularly scheduled Express TC meetings, I tried monitoring the YouTube chat because there were a couple of people who would randomly show up like that. And I wasn't sure if it was very productive anyway. And it was also very difficult because having the chat for the meeting, then having the chat for the YouTube, and having to mute the YouTube, and having the bandwidth to be able to, anyway, it was like a bunch of multitasking. I think though that model of live stream and then have the chat is a really low barrier to entry for somebody who really doesn't know what they want to do involved, because we've invited a lot of those folks to say, hey, just join the call, it's fine, you don't have to say anything. But that is actually a really intimidating thing for a lot of folks to do.
It seems to be.
So if we maybe had a model where we either set aside 5 minutes at the end to like make sure we all check the chat and then address things, or something like that, it might be a way where we can both do what we need to do where it's digging deep into the technical issues, or having that maybe expert conversation, and then but still setting aside a little bit to have that. And that might be a way for us to then also post to those people and say, hey, if you're interested in this from like a intro level or beginner perspective, here's a great spot to start, right? And maybe we need to start working on some content for those people to onboard. Maybe that's in a repo somewhere, or maybe it's on the website or blog. But that I think might help address some of this.
Right.
Who are those?
I think that's kind of like, I think what would be in scope for this group is to say that's a key thing we need to look at for success, not to figure out the answer.
Sorry, Michael. I think it was one of the points we discussed about this subject during the summit. I think maybe the 4 or 5 points, something like that, about how to bring community together, or to lower the entry level for people which do not participate currently to this kind of meeting or stuff, and how they can contribute or give their feedback or stuff like that. I think it was one of the points we discussed 2-3 months ago.
Right. So I'm agreeing from the, I think it's the I don't think I'm like in scope is saying that's one of the key things, but I'm not sure solving it is going to be should be the focus of, like, we're not going to, similarly to saying, HTTP is a strategic technical area, which is what our focus is on the technical side. we're not going to go then and try and figure out all the ins and outs of what has to happen on the HTTP side to make that happen, right?
Right. So going back to your link there, Michael, like, would it be in scope to more flush out, let's say, the personas of these constituents? Like, would that help then? Like, you know, like, what do these folks want? What does a even hypothetically, like trying to put that together, like what does a direct end user versus a application owner want? Where, like, because then that would drive, okay, and where do they live? Like,
yeah, like what's important to them that would make sense to say in terms of, okay, we're trying to say what are the strategic technical directions, right? And I guess
so
if
we
we
do
say
that, then we
something's
can see if it
important,
aligns.
yeah, exactly. Like it,
like
yep.
If these people we care about have these wants and needs,
right,
and then we are focused on X, Y, and Z because we just have decided that, do those
yep.
things align, and like where do we differ, and how can we improve, right? Like if we don't care about supporting, and on-ramping beginners and having
Yep.
like a story there, then if the people we're trying to tap are whole, if we want to grow the project and have a whole bunch of new people using Node, it's like, well, there's a mismatch there in terms of how we're.
Yeah, no, I think trying to figure out what each of those constituencies thinks is important is a good way, because we want to be able to map back okay, here's the technical direction, and HTTP is important. You should be able to map that back to who.
Right. Your
right.
audience.
So that
Yeah.
that
Like,
definitely
who's this
makes
for?
sense.
It's just because
like
you want it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, why do we think this will lead to the success of the project? It's because our constituencies, who are the people who are the stakeholders, I guess, they are interested in it for these. It's important to them for these reasons, right? It helps them do X, Y, and Z or whatever, and therefore, it's important to them. Therefore, it will make Node successful if it does these things. So I'd agree with that in terms of one of the next steps could be, what's important to each of the constituencies. And I guess we kind of did that for Node.js core maintainers. If you think about
and this is where you could get feedback. Like this is where we could have our assumptions challenged, right? Like this is where like I think a new user needs this, and really somebody comes along and says, no, actually that's.
Right.
So one thing, if we're looking for that feedback, I'd be interested to hear how folks thought the rejected promises crash survey went. Like, did we get enough feedback there? Was that feedback actually informative to the decision-making process? Because surveys are hit or miss, I guess, is right. Like,
yeah, my perspective is we got 2,500 or more. I can't remember the exact number, but it was in that ballpark of responses.
Do you know how many people were sent that survey though? So like what was like the response rate?
It wasn't like a mail out, I don't think, although we might have used, the foundation does have a mailing list, so we might have asked them. The goal was to get 2,000, I think, so we surpassed the original goal in terms of numbers.
Okay. It's just like that's 2,000, or let's say like however many responses of engaged people, right? So that persona, that type of profile of person who's willing to give feedback might be completely in that form, in that channel, might be, again, it might skew like their
sure,
wants and needs.
I would just, we have nowhere near 2,000 total engaged. And where I say engaged, I mean, like, if you total every individual who comes to any meeting, even remotely related, in the past year, and anybody who's commented on issues and committed, it's probably still not even close to 2,000. So presumably that other 1,000 or 1,500 are probably broadly on the spectrum from beginner to Node expert, would be my guess. Right. Like, sure. I know it was on Twitter. So like, if you just take a random assortment of Twitter people who follow Node folks, you know, I'm fairly confident that's probably valid in some sort of representative way.
Yeah, it's just good to know, like, potentially the reach that initial, and you might be able to get that statistics.
Yeah, we
from
could maybe
Twitter.
able to ask how, like I could ask, well, Joe's on the call. So Joe actually helped coordinate the survey. So I maybe you can ask, did we do more than, like, did it actually get sent to anybody versus just promoting on Twitter?
I think that it was maybe included in some email lists. But I don't know. I mean, there was, I think, enough like social media promotion and distribution that, you know, it'd be hard to gauge, you know, what percentage responded to it because we don't know.
It'd still be interesting to know if, like, it went to an emailing list of 500,000
Sure, and
versus
I
1,000
guess
or something.
the interesting part is, like, is that many individuals, and is there that individual constituent, is their voice equal to, let's say, like, pushback from an organization, like, right? Like, do we make decisions just based on, like, these individual that individual polling criteria versus tapping potentially large organizations that would also be impacted by these changes, right? Like, so that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I mean, we've worked on that in the past. We had a user feedback group, and actually the surveys are kind of the last remaining piece that came from that work. And we tried to set up a group which would meet regularly of organizations, you know, large organizations who were using Node, to say, okay, we're gonna meet. We're willing to do things like, you know, test out changes and give feedback, and it basically petered out. You know, lack of champions on our side, and even, you know, it wasn't, the engagement was still sort of pull versus having, you know, lots of people jumping in and making it vibrant enough that it kept going, right? Like when it came to try and bring the group together, it was mostly the champion trying to drum up discussion and interest. And
So I bring that up just because I don't see that in the list of constituents. Like, I don't see organizations, right? Like, I don't see, like, that might have a business model that's tied to it and an invested interest in the future of the project, like, and that we might want to.
Yeah, so like application developers might be, I guess, professional developers could be a proxy from them, but
Turns out to me as a huge gap.
yeah, yeah, I'm looking for where it might be, but I agree that, you know, maybe that needs to have another bullet point, which is enterprise. What would we call it?
But I'm just wondering, is it the developer, the individual, or is it that the organization has an invested interest in?
Well, that's what I meant. Another bullet point at the application developer level.
Yeah, if you just let these things be driven by ICs at companies, I think you miss out on a huge opportunity to get, you know, higher level engagement from those organizations. Right. You know, I know that's a topic that has come up at Netflix for us, is like, hey, what is the organization? We have a bunch of people who are involved in the community, but what does, like, the organization level engagement look like? And that's definitely been a big question. I think if we could answer that, that would lead to a possible future where we have a really clean story for those application developers or ICs to go to their organization at a higher level and say, here, look, Node has said you are a constituency we care about. Here's what they are doing to help support you. What can we do to support them? And if that story is more clear, I think it will lead to a really good influx of support.
Yeah, and I think so. I think you're right. That's a bit of that is a big gap there. So OpenJS Foundation members, like, I'm just thinking what we could make, like what's going to be in the PR to fix that problem. It would be adding something, I'm just pasting in the chat, something like this: enterprises with Node.js deployments. That should include OpenJS Foundation members, because that's certainly a constituency we've talked about going back to, and we can, right? Because they're part of the foundation, we have contacts. So that's a starting point.
Yeah, so I look at that, and the way I figured this out, that there's that gap, is just because when I'm considering how we weight, it's similar to like when we were talking about the values, like how do we weight our values against each other? When I look at the constituency list that you provided, I was like, oh, there seems to be a gap here, because would we not weight an organization that is supporting, let's say, a whole bunch of Node projects that will have a harder, upgrade path for any reason, or,
Yep.
or be able to, would we not weight that voice a little bit heavier than the ICs? And so that's, and again, I could be wrong. Like that's like a different discussion, but it just seemed like we were missing. There's a gap there.
Yeah, no, definitely. So does this sound like, the enterprises with Node.js deployments, OpenJS Foundation members? Let's work that into something which fills that in. And this one wasn't ordered, but it's interesting to think about, should that be ordered as well, that list of constituency?
Yeah, I'm a bit concerned. Like we don't want to and I don't think I'm the right person for sure, or like to figure out who we care about more, or who has like a larger voice. But right now it just sounds like the only way we've been getting feedback, and like we've taken that feedback and
Yep.
like said it's completely even. That's what is like, this seems like on the individual level versus like the organization level, especially potentially an organization supports the ecosystem, right? So like
Yep.
The cloud providers, like the IBMs and the Microsofts and the Googles and the Amazons, right? Like they potentially, that organization like has wants and needs that, and is a constituent of the project that like we need to, our stakeholder,
Yep.
right?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think that we need to have a very clear discussion once we define what those constituencies are, on if the larger group of contributors thinks there should be an order. So I'm worried that if we say we think there should be an order, then we're going to have to pay it.
I personally don't think there should be. Like, I don't think it's
yeah.
worthwhile trying to order those at this
No.
point. Like
No.
that I would just say, I was just saying that's an interesting thought. Hadn't come to my mind. My personal feeling is like there's a lot of other things to focus on before that would make any sense or value. And it probably, like personally, my top of my mind is it may never make sense. So
yeah, I think putting an order to that actually could have just generally negative
Yep.
consequences.
Exactly.
But I think
So
listing them is good. And I also think we
Yep.
should explicitly add that this is a two-way street. So I think that we should say our constituencies are enterprises with Node.js deployments which have a vested interest in contributing back to the project. Because I just don't think we ever want to be in a place where we're saying we're subservient in any way to these organizations that take and never give, right? Like that to me is just, that's against all of our open source principles.
So enterprises with Node.js deployments, which are here. Let me share this screen here so you can see what I'm typing.
We say that though for the individual, at the individual level too, Wes? Because like that's like, I feel like that might be
Profit-seeking organization which takes and never gives is probably different than individual which takes and never gives.
Who's making a profit though off the open source as well.
Yeah, there's a fine line there. Yeah, and that's a good. No, it's a great point, and we should definitely make sure we're clear on what.
Because you could have 10,000 people individuals respond to a poll, and they're, if we were waiting, 8,000 or 9,990 of them essentially don't contribute back to, some of these discussions and like, etc., but respond and say that they think something's important, and then we have some sort of like competing org.
I think it's more that
different.
What do we think is important to us? Like, and I think your point of it's not strictly those who come and participate in the project. Like if we have some companies who have massive deployments, and if they don't have time or interest in participating back, there's still probably value to us to understand what they're doing, right? So, it's I wouldn't personally set a bar that says you have to meet, you have to be here. As with everything, I think people who are contributing, the voice will be more strongly heard. And all these things, again, like we said, we shouldn't really rate them, because I don't think it's going to be like, well, 900 individual responses on a survey overrides one business saying X, right? It's more, these are important constituencies that we want to collect information from.
Sure.
And we
So
used all of that information to make our decision. And weighting those is never going to be like plug it into the formula. It's going to be, okay, from all the information we've got, let's make a people decision, right? Because that's what people are better at than, just a formula that's going to tell us. No formula is going to tell us what we need to do.
right. So I might drop then the which are vested in contributing back to the project.
Right.
So just full stop. And I would also err on the side of like saying enterprises. Like I know that it can be, that could still be an upstart, but like most people see enterprise and they think, large
Organizations
large,
with,
yeah.
like, and
No,
we want to
yeah.
say something like larger organizations, or like it sort of
I think
blurs the line
size-
between
Yeah.
individuals and businesses, right?
I think that was the point Darcy was trying to make, is that like a startup with 2 employees who's trying to get off the ground with Node is still, I'd say, equivalent in that regard.
They still might have scale, right? Like we don't know the impact, right? Just because they don't have thousands of employees. Like,
Right. So maybe it should be more like organizations with large Node.js deployments.
well, do we also care about medium size and startups that are deciding to use this as their platform for the next 10 years? Because a startup grows, if Netflix, or 10 years ago, we decided to use a different platform, like we would have missed out on having an enterprise person, like team and organization at the table, right? So I almost feel like it's more like we should be more focused on the startups than on large organizations today, if we're talking about the next 10 years.
Right. I'm just trying, like, what I'm playing in my mind is, a single developer who then turns themselves into an organization. Is that different? What makes the organization different versus a bunch of individual contributors, which is what we were talking about before. And what's the, like, how do we get to them differently, and as a constituency? Just trying to understand, like, because there's some sort of line versus, one person. If I take Node and I deploy it myself at home for some of my stuff,
Versus
that's
the
one
collective,
thing.
versus let's say something, it has to do with like monetary, right? There's a monetary exchange,
Right.
like potentially that's what we want to differentiate on, right? So an organization that or organization or individuals that are significant. Okay.
Does that like with significant investments in Node.js deployments,
Or have a
Darcy was saying,
monetary,
like
go
a
ahead.
financial, like a profit-seeking entity, or some sort of, where this is the same kind of thing when people have in their licenses and they say like not free for commercial use, right? Like we're trying to say the same kind of thing, right? Is like commercial entities.
I'm not sure it's even commercial, right? If there is a nonprofit with a significant investment in Node.js as an organization, that still kind of falls into my, like, I think it's the investment part, not whether you're trying to make money or what you're, if you're investing significant resources through deployments, through even by contributing to the project, that seems to be more, inclusive.
I think the more you talk about this, the more I'm on the side of just call it organizations with Node.js deployments and be done. And actually maybe even just drop Node.js deployments, or and just say organizations which use Node.js, because even that, like maybe they're using it for tooling and they're, not like they're a front end shop built on top of a SaaS. So they don't really deploy servers. They just run front ends and it's all Node.js tooling. Like that to me is the same. So I think the more we've dug in, the more I feel like going specific on this is actually to our detriment.
So organization within, I wonder if like, I kind of like investment just because that can be all sorts of different things,
Yeah, I kind of like that too.
right? Because that could be deployments because it costs you stuff, but like you said, it could also be using it for tooling. It could be,
Do
and
we
and I
want
think
to keep going back to significant? Like,
I
don't
went
know.
back to that just because. Were you going to like yes or no on that? Was it like,
I'm just wondering, like again, because I don't want to like scare off or feel like a smaller startup or organization might not feel like they have a seat
okay,
at the table
okay,
with the significance, right? And yeah,
right,
organizations with an investment in Node.js, I feel like
okay,
sort of covers the basis.
okay. Yeah, I was just, was wondering if there's some sort of,
Words.
we could, that could include every business today, right? So there's, but whether we need to say that or not, in the significant part or not really doesn't matter. It's because we're only gonna, we haven't had the challenge of too much feedback. So I think you're right that it's better to err on the side of trying to encourage people versus draw a line that excludes people. So. Anything more like OpenJS Foundation members are a very specific example. Are there other, does it make sense
Like
to have examples?
startups that are, betting their that are making the bet on Node.js for the next 10 years, like large enterprises with, as you noted, like large deployments of Node.js.
Yeah.
Large.
We just org. Sorry, I was going to put that into. Maybe just. I'm going to maybe reorder that as a. Does that sound good as an addition on that front?
Yep.
Would in terms of organizations, maybe just like also mention just completely open source orgs out there, depending on the.
True, like another open source project.
Yeah, there are
is
many, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Is that a
Not
different
necessarily
one?
the ones
Well, they may
under
have
the
a
OpenJS Foundation.
governance model that like they have representation that like their own TSC that might come and want certain things, right? Like that we would care about.
Does that not fit under like library authors or, because right, the other constituent we have there?
So again, we've done that at the individual level, as far as I can tell, like the way we've worded it for consistent.
Yeah, and
that's
here is
true,
just
oh.
because I just don't want it to be just focused on the private corporate organizations, but also acknowledge that there are other types of orgs out there.
Yeah, how about a government?
That's a good.
Government. Although, see, if I say then it's like, how is this different than the organizations with large?
You could say that the other one is enterprises, maybe. So like enterprise is like a delineation of like size for startups, enterprises, foundations, government organizations.
One thing we might be able to do to just get out of having to enumerate every single one is structure the way we list constituencies and say, here's a high level heading, and then just say examples. And then so we treat these as just examples and say they're not limited to, they're just fit your, where you fit closest in this.
Yeah.
Right.
Sounds like a good idea.
So you're saying for like, because in this one I kind of put, you know, organizational investment in Node.js, for example, than these ones, right?
Well, you could just say startups or enterprises, foundations, governments. Like you just say those words like in brackets even, like I don't think you need. Yeah.
So basically you're saying like this, or enterprises, prizes, government,
Bodies.
bodies, startups.
Foundations. Yeah, exactly. And you just do like ex dot at the beginning of that, like example of those types of orgs.
Like this. And then just get rid of this part, right?
Yeah, it just makes it more succinct, right? So it's like any org that's like utilizing.
Okay.
Because we've got the individuals really covered. We've got the application developer, we got the, you know, it just seemed like this massive gap of, there's this other type of like individual. I guess like a corporation can be a person, right? Isn't that something crazy? Like, can't you like, yeah. Can't like
well, a single person can own a corporation.
Like that? Yeah.
Is that?
True.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Corporation is effectively creating a new person, I think.
Just wild, but that's a whole other.
Yeah. Okay, so are we happy with that as a, you know, once we put that in, we've filled that gap in the constituencies?
We could also, to Roy's point, like we could add in this after startups, maybe just the other open source projects. Is that accurate?
That's still confusing to me in terms of like, how is that different from library package authors?
We could change the way that library package authors is written then.
I mean, is it that like if we added nonprofits?
Yeah, it's almost like no profits, because I just mean like a larger organization for, let's say, a library or a project or whatever are the technical aspect, right? Might include also people from that community. They're not necessarily the library authors, right? Like that's a very narrow scope there. Like, so I think just having the entire different organization as a, yeah, I think it might be different than just focusing on library authors or other just software producers out there.
I think it covers our bases.
Yeah, I think with that is fine. Yeah, just adding nonprofits there, it's probably good enough.
Okay, because like I can kind of get where, you know, yeah, it could be like, you know, say there's, yeah. Like one is in, but anyway, if you're happy with that, I think that's probably good.
Yeah, definitely good.
But maybe the library package authors, where have we covered like application? I guess application developers covers the application part.
What do you mean by that?
Well, like, you know, there's library package authors is basically a subset of developers. There are people who are now packaging it for you know, something else that then people will use, but people also will write applications which bring together. So, and I guess maybe it's blurry, like, does a library package include like a standalone application? You know, if I go in, it may be an NPM package, but it's basically like, okay, it's a database. That database happens to be written on top of Node, but it's an end thing. You know, it's not like you're going to NPM install that into something else.
I'm not entirely sure we need to specify here. So I think
yeah.
the goal of having these constituencies is that we can make sure we tailor outreach programs, support, you know, what this means. And I think that in the end, that will be the same across those different groups.
Yeah.
Just which of the constituencies does that that type of people fall into? The people who write just an application, is that falling into application developers or library package authors, or?
So taking an example here,
Yeah.
in real world, Verdaccio. It's an application. It's bundled as a library. It's published NPM, but it's an application. I don't think I think they have the same needs, the same, wants as both application developers and module authors. And I think by having those two separately, I think we cover.
Okay,
that.
so they're covered in, they fall into both of those, and that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we knew where they would end up. Okay.
Just
Okay.
time check. We got about
Yep.
10 minutes left.
Yeah. Okay. So we've mostly focused on adding that in. That sounds like a good. Are we happy with that as the addition?
Yeah, I feel like we stumbled on.
Does anybody want
Good
to
catch.
take the action to PR it in?
I mean, you've written it. I feel bad. I think you should take. I mean,
I'm happy to do it, but I'm also happy
yeah.
to have somebody else do it. Like, I don't think we all did it, right? I just happened to be the hands on the typewriter, so I'm happy to have anybody who wants to do it. Otherwise, it's a one-liner. I don't mind doing it. So.
Somebody want their first commit?
It is good to have, multiple multiple collaborators, right?
I can do it, Michael. I'll do
Okay,
it.
Darcy will
There you
PR
go.
in. Perfect, thanks.
Yay! Thanks,
Yay.
Darcy.
Okay.
I don't know who Daisy is, but
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go.
Mute.
Okay. Okay. So it sounds like then the next thing we want to focus on is figuring out what we think each of the constituencies needs. Is that like that?
yeah,
That
that's kind
seems
of
like
where
a
I was
reasonable
going.
suggestion.
That's kind of where I was going. Yeah, like and because again, like I'm trying to get us to the point where we have a good understanding, or like the people, like we can go to each constituent and say, like, is this actually, like, here's our assumptions of things you
Right.
want, is this accurate? And then you can try to ensure that you're getting feedback from like the right people from the right channels, and
Right.
then we can map up their wants and needs against what we're actually planning and prioritizing in the next 10 years. I think that's really
Right.
that's what we want. So yeah, like next step I think is to outline, what does this persona want and need versus this, and then then we know when we're making a decision who that's tailored to, like who, when we choose
Right.
to put something on the roadmap, or prioritize some work,
Okay.
like who is this affecting, right?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's good as a it makes sense to me as a way to try and, as opposed to just throwing out technology and trying to say, hey, we think this is important, to have a way we can trace it back to the constituencies to say why and who cares and so forth.
So do we think next steps on this would be to custom tailor a outreach, approach to each of these group, right? Because I just like a survey sounds great, and we could do the same thing with individuals, but doing that to organizations is probably not going to be very productive. Like, what do we see being the concrete next steps out of this?
What I was thinking was, like, we're out of time this meeting, but next meeting doing getting Darcy to set up the board like he did when we were working on the values. And I know we won't get it right because we're a small subset, but trying to have something tangible to start with, like blank. We can't just go out to the groups with blank space. I think we can try and fill in the space with what we think is right, and then take that to one of the groups. We can look at what that looks like, figure out which of the constituencies we want to take it to first, but I suspect next meeting we would basically use the meeting to do that. Let's use the board, get everybody to come up with what they can think of, and then trying to put that into a shape that looks reasonable to get feedback on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can totally do that. If you can add that as an action item for me, so I know to prep it for the next
Okay,
call.
so next meeting, do
And maybe this shape.
brainstorm on what each constituency needs. Darcy, is it like this action? Darcy to set up boards.
Just the
I
columns.
think
yeah.
board,
Columns that we want.
which would be, so basically what would those columns be? Let's talk about that. Like it's going to be the constituency.
Yeah, let's shoot. I think you got it right with boards. So like we could just
Yeah.
do one for each
Okay.
each one, right? So yeah, and it'll
Right.
be like, yeah.
There's going to be there's going to be like a need, right?
Probably want, need, and don't want, hate, or I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Avoid.
Well, why don't we just say that? Don't want, right?
Don't want. Yeah.
We might be able to come up with a better thing, but that's.
I guess like want would already do that. Like you don't really need the want. Like they want stability. They don't want instability, right? Like would be for, let's say, like an enterprise or something, or that could be for everybody.
Although I don't think having that column is bad, because there might be things where it's not, like sometimes hard to negatively. I guess you can just say don't want. So sure, yeah.
or maybe don't need, because something in Node are not used by a company, or exceptionally by a small company or small subset. But let's say at least currently, let's say an API and stuff like that, I don't think it's really used by a lot of companies which are using Node.js to deploy some kind of serverless or stuff like that, or anything, or even a REST API. So maybe they don't, it's not a don't want, but they don't really need, or they don't use this kind of functionality or stuff. So maybe it could be good to have a feedback on that also.
I think I kind of like having the separate columns too, because you can, like, then we can, when we look at them, we can sort of agree, everybody wants this, everybody, that's kind of separate from, but don't want this, right? And what's the difference between want and need?
Not clue. We can get rid of it.
Yeah, I'm just not sure, like how I would say versus the, like how I could figure out what they really need versus what it seems they want or whatever. So what do people think?
I think for the sake of our planning, I think it's fine to drop it. But I do think at some point there is this is blocking us from adopting said technology versus, yeah, fine. Like, I understand you don't have it. We might want it in the future.
Right. Okay.
But
so
again,
that could
for
be
this conversation, that's super valuable to differentiate.
I think, no, if that, given that is the understanding, I think want, don't want. There's need, want. I think how about does it make sense to be need, want, and don't want? Well, no, that's still they're still kind of different. I think with your description that's fine, and we'll just see what pops up in those. It's
because again, we can always just simplify it. If we do it and we see, oh, they're just basically overlapping, we just move them over and delete the column.
yeah, no, I think that's good. So I'm happy with that. We are pretty much at time, so I think that's our next step. We can open an issue. When I do the minutes, I can open an issue to start to say this is what our next focal thing is, so it shows up on the agenda, and we can go from there.
Awesome.
Thanks for everybody's time. Talk to you later.
Right. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.